Hey, everybody. So, we are going to dig into unofficial actors in the policy process a bit deeper today, talking about individual actions and so the role of the individual. Let's start. So, the power of individual action is the idea around this discussion. And we've talked a little bit already in our discussion of unofficial actors about several different types, right? We've talked about political parties, we've talked about think tanks, we've talked about interest groups, and we've mentioned social movements, right? And so now we're going to dig down to what the individual can do, right? The individual can have direct action methods where they are demonstrating, they're participating in protests and marches, engaging in civil disobedience, and public communication. Other ways where the individual can have an impact is through institutional engagement. So this is reaching out directly to officials, participating in elections. That's the very least that we can do, right? Just go and vote. Policy entrepreneurship. And so let's put some context here to our discussion. And we've all known there's been a spate of political violence in the U.S. Over the past, decades, but especially recently, it feels like this is kind of leading to a point where it's occurring much more frequently than it has in a long time. We have this kind of violence against unofficial policy actors, right? So individuals, violence against individuals and groups, right? Attacks on our elected officials, violence in our community spaces. And what we need to think about is that in a democracy, in our democratic system, we do have legitimate channels for individual action. Political violence undermines this. It undermines our democratic participation. So what I want to talk about here then is nonviolent action. Practical, so violence delegitimizes and causes and invites repression. Nonviolent action is moral because it respects human dignity and maintains the ethical high ground. And it's strategic because this is how you can build broad coalitions and sustain movements. So the case study we're using and the reading that we have for this discussion is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. And he wrote this letter while in the Birmingham jail. And this is because he was in prison for participating in nonviolent protests against segregation. And so one of the kind of key quotes that comes out of this letter is that he writes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught up in the inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." So I hope you've had a chance to read this. It's a powerful letter, and it's written April 16th, 63, like I said, from his jail cell. And it was a call for a response to 8 Alabama clergymen who were criticizing the civil rights demonstrations in the 60s, and they called for unity. And King kind of pushes back against that call from these clergymen in Birmingham and around Alabama in this letter. And he explains his whole reasoning why. King's movements faced violence, bombings, assassinations, church bombings, protesters being beaten, and eventually King's own assassination in 1968. But the movement that was created by King and so many others during this time period succeeded because of nonviolence. So King had some direct action methods, right, for thinking about the approach he lays out in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He talks about nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, public demonstrations, and strategic communications. And all of this requires, as he writes out, discipline, training, and a commitment. four basic steps as he lays them out in the letter is collecting facts, documenting injustice, building evidence, attempting a dialogue, and seeking a peaceful resolution. And when that fails, you can build to the next steps. And you are legitimized by your attempt to negotiate. One is to train in nonviolence and prepare for the conflict. And he kind of goes through this several different ways about how they were able to prepare themselves for to be able to sit in jail, to be ready to take whatever consequence came from their participation in the policy process. All right, this was the self-purification that's described in his letter. And then he says direct action. Create productive tension, forcing negotiation, while maintaining nonviolent discipline. So, self-purification and why it matters. You're facing violence without responding to violence. Protesters were trained to just take the attacks and practice responses to provocations. Right? So this preparation prevented the movement from being discredited. It won them public sympathy. Right? They weren't throwing back bottles. They weren't flipping cars over. They weren't looting stores. They weren't trying to attack any police officers or anything like that. Right? They showed that they were being nonviolent, and they held the moral superiority of the case against the police forces and official policy actors and the people who work for them when they were expressing or they were participating in violence against nonviolent people. So you gain the moral high ground in a sense. This productive tension is forcing society to confront the injustice and make what is going on currently, that status quo, untenable. And so doing this without violence involves sit-ins at lunch counters, boycotts of segregated businesses, marching through hostile areas, filling jails with mass arrests, going and saying, fine, you're going to arrest us. That's fine. We're going to sit here and we are going to fill up your jail because we're going to keep sending people to non-violently protest whatever's going on. And they are prepared to do that through that self-purification. So there are these kind of impact strategies of all of this. And these involve influencing public opinion, right? And institutional pressure. So again, you have the moral high ground. You can engage with the media, build coalitions, and then legal action, and then direct negotiation. Leadership is very important here. And this individual leaders matter as they work through organizations, build collective power, use legitimate democratic means. But the key activities they do is articulate a vision, strategy development, and coordinate movements. So contemporary individual action, traditional methods, demonstrations and marches, boycotts, direct communication, voting and engagement. Other things, the other modern tools that we have are social media activism, digital organizing, online advocacy, crowdfunding campaigns. Individuals face limits, right? Limited resources, the potential for retaliation. You go out there and put a social media post out trying to engage, it's going to get some attention, maybe not the attention that you want, which is the difficult part, right? And then actually sustaining the positive attention, what you really do want, is very difficult. You need institutional support. The idea is that when individuals form groups, they're able to build movements, and movements engage institutions. I think that what's really hard here is that if we do have these movements, we do kind of boycott Target or boycott Home Depot or whatever kind of movement of the moment is, they are short-lived, right? The public's going to end up going back to just shopping at one of these places, or even some of the movements that we had, in the like in 2020, right, with the these kind of large public movements, the Me Too movement, the everybody's wearing the same hat type idea, and the demonstrations and the marches are occurring. Over time, that attention fades, right? People kind of move on to the next thing. And so the goal of anybody who's trying to keep this movement going and actually have a real impact on the policy process is to maintain that coalition, maintain the attention on whatever the issue is. That can be a super big challenge. And I think that's where the leadership in the civil rights movement and what's described in King's letter is that you have to prepare the people to participate, right? To make it something that is part of them, and then keep the movement going, right? Because if you are participating in this nonviolent action, right? If you are protesting in a nonviolent way and you're getting attention and you're taking the moral high ground, people will pay attention to you, right? The media is going to stay focused on whatever activities you're doing and highlighting the positive activities, right? If as soon as the violence occurs, right, as soon as a bottle is thrown or a car is flipped or whatever, then the attention turns negative, and you're going to lose anybody who was there to participate or support or join your movement. And this is because violence undermines democratic norms, it delegitimizes the cause, it invites escalation, and it invites repression, and it can narrow the support. Just like I was saying, as soon as that car is flipped, then your movement, your protest, your whatever it is, you've lost the high ground. And so that's the difficulty there. Democratic action, it uses legitimate channels. We're trying to build these coalitions, trying to sustain change, and strengthen our institutions. So we talked about policy entrepreneurs, and here's kind of a maybe a more defined definition of it, where it's this kind of individual impact by identifying an issue, coming up with a solution, building coalitions, recognizing when a policy window opens, and support for however the policy goal is the implementation of it is supported. This is kind of operating within the system. Policy entrepreneur is a key component of the three streams and policy windows model of John Kingdon. When we start talking about and you begin to apply your policy change models for your paper in the course, right? This is kind of a key component of that model where somebody is identifying, describing, defining well an issue that people can actually believe. Hey, that is a good definition of this issue. I buy into this person's definition of it. And that person, because we buy into their definition of the problem, they're defining the solution. Right? We've already kind of talked about that a little bit. And so once they do that, people believe and they join the coalition of that person, that entrepreneur, right? Because they say, okay, you've defined this problem. We agree with that definition. You're giving us a solution. All right, how do we build a coalition and get people to recognize when the opportunity is right to achieve our policy goal? And then follow through on it with the implementation. So this kind of, how do we do this? How do we do our nonviolent action? How do individuals engage in a democratic way, right? In a safe way. So protection for elected officials, protection for protesters and activists, gathering spaces for communities, right? Democratic systems only work when participation is safe, right? So having the ability to get out there, because it is safe to be out there, is a kind of key component of a democracy. And when you see it going to where you're wanting to protest and you're wanting to participate in marches and it isn't safe, that's a failure of the democratic system. So kind of some key discussion points. Individual versus collective action. There's kind of a role for leadership to be involved. which helps build movements and make strategic choices. The moral authority is your political sacrifice or personal sacrifice. You may be going to jail, right? You have kind of ethical frameworks to apply to whatever concern that you have, saying that what is going on is unethical, is immoral. And your ability, because you have that moral authority, lends to being able to persuade the public to your side. The questions we have to ask is, when is action worth the risk? And how do we protect our democratic actors? Another thing we have to think about is policy change, and policy change occurring in the short run or in the long run, right? So what are the direct and indirect effects, and what are the short and long-term impacts that you have from your participation as an individual in the policy process? And then the boundaries, right? Where are they? When is civil disobedience justified? Why is violence going to fail? Right? This is kind of distinguishing between legitimate action, right, of civil disobedience when it's appropriate, and illegitimate action, violence. So understanding individual impact, another quote coming straight from King's letter: human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless effort of men willing to be co-workers with God. That is co-creating the society that we want, right? Working with each other, building it together. So individual action shapes policy through direct pressure on institutions, public opinion influence, movement leadership, moral persuasion. And the key takeaway is individual action requires strategic, sustained, nonviolent efforts to create policy change. So recent events, recent political violence, it silences voices rather than uplifting or amplifying them. It weakens democracy for everyone. And it makes legitimate policy debate even harder. The civil rights movement succeeded because it maintained nonviolent discipline, it used democratic channels, it built its moral authority, and it created sustainable change. So I have some discussion questions that I built into this slide deck, a couple of pages of them. Think about them. These are worth reflecting on. These are worth kind of thinking about as you discuss individual actors in your overall paper for this course. And think about it as how you want to develop your own way to engage in the political process. And here's a little bit more. I went overboard. But there's a lot here, right? We see problems that out there, we shake our fists at the cloud and we're like, why can't we solve this? And how can I get involved, right? My aim for you in this class is to understand that, right? To get involved, to know how change happens, to know when you can capitalize on policy windows, when you have to kind of give everything you want to advocate effectively for public policy that you desire and that you think is appropriate. All right, finally, wrapping it up, connecting the three lectures that we had, the several lectures and discussions that we've had around around unofficial policy actors, right? Interest groups, organized resource, they have institutional access, social movements, mass mobilization, they have collective identity, public pressure, and individual action, personal agency, moral authority, and entrepreneurship. That's it for this discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you spent some time really kind of soaking in and reading Dr. King's letter. It's powerful. I think the ability to engage the policy process, like I said, the very least you can do is vote. So do that, right? If you see some problem out there, the very, very least you can do is vote. But there's so much more. There's so many different ways that you as an individual can get involved in the policy process to kind of make this world the place you want it to be. So get out there and do it. And thanks very much. I'll see you next time.